Okay, I'll call this meeting to order. This is the City Council Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, April 21st, 2025. I think at the present time, I'd like to have the mayor share a somewhat momentous announcement.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bertani. It's with great sadness that I share with the community that Deputy Mayor Bodie passed away early Thursday morning. It was a shock to all of us. She was a dear, dear friend, a civic leader, environmental evangelist, and espoused everything that Lake Forest Park is about. And we're all processing. There's a lot of things going on right now that legally that we have to take care of, but our hearts and prayers go out to her family and friends. We wanted to give the family a time to reach out to the people that they cared about that were important to them before the city preempted anything like that. And as such, we've released a press statement today. The flags were ordered to be at half-mast yesterday, and it's fitting that a police sergeant lowered the flags at half-staff after the issuing of the executive order. Deputy Mayor Bodie was a very big fan of the police department, as we all are, and they were very fond of her, and so I think it was fitting. Again, our hearts and prayers go out to her family and friends. And on Thursday, we will be honoring Deputy Mayor Bodie to the best we can. Words cannot. Yeah, Thursday. So I'm sorry, folks. It's been a lot to process. So I thank you, Mayor Bertani, Deputy Mayor Bertani, for stepping up.
Oh, and thanks.
Hopefully, I'm still there. But
yeah. Well, thank you, Mayor French. And I think, you speak for all of us, the suddenness and the shock. And I think one thing I'd like to do is to ask for a moment of silence for our Deputy Mayor. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate that. And I'm going to invite the council to offer their reflections if they choose at our tribute on Thursday. So appreciate it very much. Thank you, council. All right. So we'll get back to our agenda here. We have public comments. So do I have the thingy? Okay. So a little delay here as we get our clipboard. Okay. Thanks. All right. So we have the disclaimer I should be reading. I should have read it earlier. The committee is not accepting online public comments. This portion of the agenda is set aside for the public to address the council on agenda items or any other topic the council might have purview or control over. However, the committee may not respond to comments from the public. If the comments are of a nature that the council does not have influence or control over, then the deputy mayor or presiding officer may request the speaker suspend their comments. The council may direct staff to follow up on items brought up by the public. Comments are limited to a 3-minute time limit. All right. And with that, we'll start with Randy Banneker. Welcome.
Thank you, sir. Council members, Mr. Mayor, I'm Randy Banneker. I'm here on behalf of the Seattle-King County Realtors and wanted to comment on the sign code, which we'll be discussing tonight. Our members place a high value on the opportunity to represent buyers and sellers in the city of Lake Forest Park, and signs play an important role in that process in a swift and smooth real estate transaction. We support the code update, but we have a respectful request for 2 minor modifications. There are two types of real estate signs that the industry uses widely. The for sale sign that's placed in front of the house for sale. And it's typically a live area sign that's supported on a yard arm type configuration. It's 24 inches by 30 inches, which is 5 square feet. And that sign, the top of that sign is about 5 feet off the ground. The yard arm supporting structure is a little bit higher. The other signs are A boards, open house signs that you'll see posted only during open house hours, which are typically 1 to 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, sometimes different days, but a limited time. They are 24 inches by 24 inches, 4 square feet, and they are placed in the right of way, but outside of traffic and sidewalk lanes. Their goal is to just point people towards the home that's for sale. They're expensive, and so brokers do not leave them out. They're $100 a pop, and so there's a real incentive to make sure they're not left out for any time beyond the open. As discussed in the memo from Director Hoffman, we're requesting an increase in the size allowance on those temporary A-born signs from 3 square feet to 4 square feet. And that would accommodate the industry, the typical dimensions that are used throughout the region. That's for the open house A boards. And similarly for the on-premises, on-site for sale signs, we ask that you allow 5 square feet and a 5-foot sign height, again, to accommodate that for sale sign. Just a quick note about signs remain important to the transaction, even in an era where technology plays a growing role. Signs just help people drive a neighborhood and get a sense of what it's like, and they can see what's for sale. The last thing in my last 13 seconds, I want to make sure I say that signs are important to fair housing. They just don't discriminate. Anyone can see what's for sale. Anyone can see which house is an open house. And that's really important just to preserve that fair housing opportunity. Thank you.
I appreciate it, Mr. Banneker. Thank you. Okay, so next up we have Sarah Phillips. Welcome.
First, I want to express my condolences for the death of your colleague. That her death is a loss for all of us and a loss for the community. I read briefly through the sign code, and I just wanted to raise some concerns. Sort of in 3 areas. One is the vertical banners for the town center. When you see them out there, they're very small. I don't know what the measurements are, but the council 20 years ago was very concerned about having banners in the town center. They're now much more common and they're much larger. The ones that are actually at the Safeway store are considerably larger than what would be allowed on a vertical banner. And we're encouraging you to increase that size so that when the banners that are already there are redeveloped by the town center, who creates and maintains them, they'd have the option of making some that are larger, easier to read. The second is about the garden tour, and the garden tour has a lot of signs on one day. We have probably 25 signs, and some of them are in the right of way. There are one-day signs directing people to various locations of the garden tour. We're shifting to QR codes so that maybe that'll shift, but we want to make sure everybody can get them. We're also, the people who put the signs up are trying to help people who aren't from Lake Forest Park navigate some of our trickier intersections, and they do that with the sign code. And it looked like we couldn't have them on one day, but I'm not sure about that. And the last is the issue of banners on fences and walls. The garden club, the Pack the Park, and the garden tour all use banners that are set up on fences, some in Animal Acres, some on the side of the Lake Forest Park School to advertise events. They're usually up they're reusable, but my observation is they're reusable banners, so they're up for 6 days. Then they say this Saturday or this day, and those are effective ways of reaching people. And it looked, I don't know, I didn't read that's a pretty dense document, but it looked to me like you couldn't have those. So I just wanted to sort of raise those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and we have Roz Bird. Welcome.
Thank you. So I want to reiterate just a bit of what Sarah said. I'm specifically talking about signs for the garden tour, which benefits the city. It's not really a city event, but all the proceeds benefit the city by some going to the 4 nonprofit groups that put it on, and the rest goes to public art. And as you know, our second piece is in process. So it's really, it's a kind of a city event. We want people to know about it. We want people to come, and signs are one of the ways that they find out. As you know, it's hard to get city information out to people here. Yes, we use the Shoreline Area News. I find many people don't read it. They don't know anything about it. City sends out an email to some people, but not to everybody. Signs are really important. And I read through the proposed sign code, and like Sarah, I got concerned about banners because those are important. They're only up for a week. We know the time limit. They come down the afternoon of the event or the next day for sure. The signs that we put out around the neighborhoods for a week, we know it makes a difference. And so I hope those aren't really as strict as they sounded to me when I read through it, and that we'll still be able to, market this fun community event with signage. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, is there anybody else in the chambers who'd like to make a comment? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close comments. Oh, sorry. Oh. I was premature. Let's see. I have a public comment, which I guess I'll read out loud from Celia Soto. Honorable City Council members, first, my condolences to you on the passing of Deputy Mayor Bodie. She was also the Vice Chair of the Third Place Commons Board of Directors, and we are mourning this tragic loss as well. Her passing is a tremendous loss for our entire community. Thank you for the announcement that the city released this afternoon and the kind words that were shared. We will all miss her friendship, incredible expertise, and ability to bring people together around shared goals for the common good. Secondly, I became aware late today that you will be discussing sign regulations tonight. This is an issue that I currently know very little about, but hope to become much more familiar with before a public hearing, as it may impact Third Place Commons and the Lake Forest Park Farmers Market. It is also timely because I have been discussing new farmers market vertical signs for the lampposts in the town center parking lot with Merlone Geyer. My understanding is that current city regulations limit those signs flags to be only 2 feet in length and 1 foot in width, or something similar. The current Safeway signs are much larger than that, and it would be ideal to have more flexibility with the market signage. I am sorry that I am sorry that I am unable to be there in person tonight, but will plan on watching the video tomorrow. Thank you for your consideration of this issue and thoughtful debate, and I hope to contribute to the discussion during the public hearing. Thank you for your service. With that, I think I will close the comments. All right, so council members, we have a couple of items on our agenda. The first of which is Ordinance 25-1308, amending Chapter 18.52 of the Lake Forest Park Municipal Code, signage, to bring the sign code into compliance with recent legal decisions. And I think Director Hoffman's going to be presenting to us.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor and Council. I'll spare you the history. There's a long history, lots of planning commission, lots of city council. This item was brought back to city council March 27th to discuss and receive questions. Staff has a new memo from Friday afternoon with 8 items that represent that discussion. And the goal tonight is to cover 4 general areas. 1, any new or additional city council changes or concerns. 2 would be staff items. Those are the 8 plus items in my Friday afternoon memo. The realtors items, one of which is in my memo and one that we should add tonight in the discussion. And then some level of understanding on the existing non-conforming sign code that was included in the past materials. Staff's not sure that was clearly or ever discussed to decide whether to amend, leave alone, or not. So as part of this comprehensive sign update, we want to check in on that. It wasn't in any of the drafts and so forth. So with those 4 things, it's at your pleasure. I'm available to answer any questions. I was hoping to at least go through the 8 items in the Friday memo. And those were made part of the packet, I believe, yesterday. So the page numbers may be a little confusing, but the intent is that it's a 3-page memo with an attachment. The page numbers referred to in the memo are the attachment 1. Now they have an additional packet number on the bottom in your packet.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Council members, my suggestion is that we're going to be talking about the 8 items that Director Hoffman mentioned, but I'd like to open the floor up for questions for Director Hoffman if anyone has any before that. So, do you have questions? Councilmember Lebo.
Perhaps less the question than a comment. I would be fine on a couple things. So it was suggested that for realtors that we modify the code to reflect the A signs as well as the for sale signs. And I would be amenable to both. There was a suggestion that the height of a for sale sign would not exceed 5 feet. I'd be good with 6 feet because sometimes they have a post that goes up a little higher. So that no part of the for sale sign would be higher than 6 feet. Would be a suggestion for the
Thank you.
council.
And just by way of background, we exchanged various emails today confirming the first one, but also discussing the how to measure sign height. Is it the top of the sign or the top of the pole? The intent is to not read the sign. It's a temporary sign, but to make the numbers work. So 5 square feet would capture the industry standard for the sign itself as the definition measures. The post, though, is an 8-something foot post, buried 2 feet, could be 6 foot. Our intent is to measure the top of the sign without making this too wordy.
Okay, I'd be fine with that.
Okay.
So that if the post extended beyond 5 feet is not regulated, I'd be fine. But you don't want to have an extreme, 10-foot post with something else on it. The other for council consideration is that I'm fine with what Safeway's done and what Chase has done for their openings. And so from my perspective and for the council consideration is that something similar be allowed within the code. And then whatever that looks like, because in terms of, for example, pennants would not be permitted under the existing code because they move with the wind, which are the little flags that are strung on the wire that runs between the posts, as an example, would not otherwise be permitted. I'm fine with what Safeway's done. I'm fine with what Chase has done to promote businesses, I think is fine. And then the other comments with regard to particular events like the garden show, the Secret Garden, and Fun in the Park, or any bands, I'm fine with putting up banners on a temporary basis, whether they be on fences or some other way to advertise those. I don't think that's going to otherwise create a nuisance for the city. I offer that as consideration for the council.
I appreciate that, Councilmember Lebo. Does anybody else have a question for our director? Okay. All right. Well, I think I'm going to add thing here. I'm appreciative of basically the work that you've put into this. At the risk of doing some math on TV here, I think the for sale signs being 2 foot by 3 foot would need 6 square feet of sign area. So yeah, I'd be okay with what Councilmember Lebo said. And then I guess for our friends over in the garden tour, then I think the number was also something of a concern with 25. I don't think that violates anything that we've done.
I've only analyzed the issues that I have. I can further analyze
Okay.
anything you want, but I would be hesitant to change any individual item without taking the time to read through the entire code on the spot, even though I'm asking you to make amendments today.
That's fair. Oh,
Just a point of clarification, I think the for sale industry standard was 20 inches by 30 inches, which would be 5 square feet.
okay.
The discussion we had today for the second realtor, the arm sign, is a balance between all temporary signs on private property. So in that context and what the planning commission recommendation is, I think there's flexibility to add that type of realtor arm sign, which is totally fundamental to the industry. But keeping in mind the balance that all signs will be measured by that criteria, all temporary signs in that context. So the further afield we stray from the planning commission recommendation, the unintended consequences, 5 square feet would allow the industry standard. There's always different size signs. Somebody could say, my house is special. I want 10 square feet. There's a process for that. But the industry standard would be met by 5 square feet, two-sided, with a support arm and a number that whatever the consensus of the council. Staff's intent would be to measure the sign height, not the support arm, within reason. A 20-foot support arm with a 5-foot sign looks a little weird.
I had a question
ahead.
about the flags that are flying. Was there a specific reason why they were being restricted or limited?
Sign noise,
Sign noise.
Yeah.
Okay.
celebration signs and so forth were a definition that was recommended to be deleted. Half of what you see out there fits the definition of flag, fluffy, airman, balloon category. Staff could look at a new balance that without reading a sign, temporary in nature, would allow certain things, but that's what the commission's attempt was. Eliminate
also-
the frilly, fluffy things and get to the signs and minimize sign noise.
I'm okay with the flags out there. I think it looks festive myself.
All right. Any other questions? Go ahead.
For instance, what Safeway has up, if we were to allow that, do we have any current language anywhere in our sign code about removing things when they're no longer in good working order, when they look tattered? Like, is there something about
We do,
having to
yeah.
take things down?
I
Okay.
believe it's not subject to amendment here, and it's the last section, obligation. I think there's 2 sentences in this entire code that really express,
Okay.
you need to maintain your sign.
Yeah. So I think if,
a good
I also
point.
think it's festive. It's lovely to be able to see things being improved and celebrated, but it needs to look good.
Yeah.
As far as the I don't know, the banner flags, I don't know what they are, but the curvy ones. I think we just have to be really careful about enforcing the sight lines, the vehicular sight lines, especially in a parking lot where you have pedestrians walking. So while the sign itself, I don't have a huge opinion on, some of those signs do feel like they may be impeding some sight lines as you're moving through the parking lot. And I think that should be something that we should be just keeping an eye on. and
Absolutely.
mentioning, and
Yeah.
and maybe they can move some signs kind of thing.
Now, for public right of way, that we have that, that discretion to maximize safety. This may be a little light on private property.
All right. Does anybody else have any? I'm looking back at the previous meetings notes and seeing if there was anything that Deputy Mayor Bodie had wanted, because this is, of course, one of her major things. I'm not seeing anybody. Does anybody recall a concern she particularly had? All right, then. So I think, yeah, Director Hoffman, the one thing I do remember that she was bringing up was all the different time limits And I think we've kind of resolved that, or is that still, I know one of them is still basically one thing that we have to approve, but the other things that she brought up in your memory, do you recall if there's anything else that needs to be done there?
Two come to mind. One is the fewer than, less than. I have to admit, had to Google that grammatical rule, having seen less than my entire career. Now I'm a convert. If it's a countable noun, it's fewer than. I get that. But the other one was the time limit for removal. Currently stands at 10 days. Luckily, what we've seen out in the field is they're removed immediately, if not the next day. So we're fairly lucky. But I believe my memo brings that up to for a possibility of 5 days.
It does. Yeah, and I think we came to the agreement that for political signs, especially those for primary and the general election, they're considered to be the same event.
Staff considers that more of a standard operating procedure,
Mhm.
and that's how I interpret it. The event is the election. Right? What type of election to me is irrelevant. Yes, if you're a candidate and you're running in the primary and the general, to you, that's one big effort. I agree. But for sign enforcement, what I would like to see and what I've seen in other cities is politeness that follows the King County Elections Manual, which is not that strict in that regard. But after the primary, if you're no longer involved, please remove your signs. If you're still involved, you have that option. But the jurisdiction and the county would very much like those to be removed. There's a take a breath and then put out again in a new window for the general. It's a touchy subject. Every jurisdiction's different, but that's the intent. And so if you view the primary and the general as two different events, that would be in keeping with my understanding of code enforcement.
Sounds wonderful. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I think we'll just sort of dive into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, which is if you have your memorandum that Director Hoffman circulated, we'll just go in order and get a temperature. So the first section is on the existing codifiers of note. And I'm not sure this is particularly controversial. I need to run that by you.
In theory, the codifier's note should have disappeared at the relevant time. It didn't. So we're proposing to get rid of the note, but honor the Planning Commission's recommendation. And I believe one of those sections is kept, one is deleted, and one is modified. But all the, as they're treated in the Planning Commission's recommendation, they're relevant.
Right.
And the note would disappear.
So I think you're looking for more of a head nod here.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, the next section is on strikeout underline typographic error.
So on page 4 of the attachment, and that's to really get into the fine grain. Prohibited is added, underlined, illegal is struck.
Right.
So there's 2 instances there, just to make sure it's discussed before the public hearing version comes up, which is in ordinance form.
Go ahead.
I think that's fine. Question though, in the Municipal Code 1866-125 non-conforming signs, it refers to illegal signs. Is there an intent to change that to prohibited signs? This is the last section that was added.
That I would leave to the council. There's been no mention in the videos or any of the record that I've seen that have touched the non-conforming sign section. I can't assume that's because no amendments are required or it was overlooked. So that's why I'm clarifying. If we are considering amendments to 1866, that would be one to make it consistent with what I'm assuming will be an amendment going forward with the sign chapter.
So I'm fine with the amending 1866-125 non-conforming signs to reflect that it's prohibited signs rather than illegal, so it's conforming with the other sign changes. in reading that particular section. Otherwise, I was fine with it.
I could,
Anybody have other comments on that one?
I agree.
Makes sense.
I could add that to the ordinance version.
I have to admit, I don't know the legal distinction between prohibited and illegal, but I'm happy to hear what it is.
It's, I think it's good to remain consistent. I mean, if you're using it one place, let's be consistent throughout.
Right. So if they are truly synonymous, then yeah, I have no problem with that. I just didn't want to open a can of worms that, oh my goodness, it's now prohibited rather than illegal and somebody comes to us with that. But I think the intent is the same, so. Yeah.
I think the intent's the same, but one is like a judgment, whereas the other one is a regulation.
Gotcha.
So prohibited seems more regulation.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so on the subject of 1866, the amortization period for non-conforming signs, is that something, Director Hoffman, you were planning to take us through tonight? Or is that not being considered as part of this round of revisions?
It currently is not being considered, but it needs to be discussed in the context of, is that the council's intent? If it is the council's intent, I would suggest a meeting with the city attorney, executive session possibly at some point.
Oh, go ahead.
I would say, I think it would be useful for us to take a look at the non-conforming signs, but I don't want that to slow down the sign code process. If we have to loop back and look at non-conforming afterwards, I would be okay with that. I just don't want to slow down the sign code process.
Go ahead.
I would be consistent with that as well. To ask the question though, is there a need to otherwise change that particular ordinance? With regard to, for example, amortization, is there something that's driving that? Or if we just do nothing, it would remain as is. Is that correct?
Staff's position is we're looking at these amendments separate from whatever may be in the field. Clearly not applying these to specific situations that we see out in the public. So in that context, we're just merely offering it up as, is this the path of the city? Being that it relates to signs. Amortization closes out a nonconformity. Some cities, you can continue the nonconformity subject to a few conditions. You know, change of business, change of use, 180 days. I would say being here only a year, at this point, I've seen nothing to indicate the city in the last 12 years would like to go away from amortization. At some point in the past, they may have had a conversation with the city attorney. It may have been a while ago. So if that's something you would look into, the background separate from what's out in the field of those 2 points of view, legal nonconformity into the future or a method to more strongly deal with nonconformities.
But if we do nothing right now, the amortization period would remain.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So my question is there something driving it otherwise to change that?
Not from staff's perspective. We attempt every code amendment to see where else it would affect other chapters. And this came to light in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
And just following up, yeah, I'm fine keeping our current language regarding the amortization period. My hope would be that staff would be on the lookout if there are signs that are currently allowed that would no longer be allowed under the revisions to make sure that you're connecting with the relevant sign owners to make sure they're aware.
In some fashion, that would be our intent. Yeah.
And yeah, then I'm fine with the current 3-year period.
All right, sounds good. So we do have, just getting back to what we were on, we have the head nod on that typo thing.
I think so. I mean, but we're always, I'm always open to hardship. So that if we make it and there's something that unintended consequence that results from that we didn't realize, I would certainly be open to.
It's been some time, you know, the research I've done for this code, you know, you find all the past instances and 1999, 2001, there was an effort. It was begun by Public Works. They inventoried all signs and didn't declare nonconformities, but labeled them for this effort. And then for whatever reason, after the inventory, the citywide effort did not take place. And there's no effort, or there's no evidence that the effort was revisited. So how that would be implemented is, at the very minimum, when someone applies for a permit or some sort of request from the city, it will be brought up. It's a separate discussion about, does the city want to do a citywide effort, or, dedicate staff and resources to focus on that?
All right, then we'll move on to the next thing on planter beds. There are two sections that are highlighted there that include planter strip / beds.
This is just adding the words planter strips beds to round out the conversation we would have in the field. There are situations, not many, where there's a lane of travel, a curb, a planter strip, a sidewalk, and then some amount of undeveloped right of way. The question will come up in the future. It's not in the lane of travel. It's not on the curb. It's not on the sidewalk. And I can't put it 5 feet and stay in the right of way. Can I use the planter bed? Adding these words would clarify that situation, that you can't. It goes hand in hand with what's allowed in the right of way, safety, and makes it uniform. They're either allowed or they're not. So right now, as drafted, the code doesn't include planter strips, planter beds, but it includes very similar items, roundabouts, medians, things like that. So it's a small item, but it will come up.
Just a clarification, the intent of this planter strip beds is to be not in the median. You're not talking about median planter strips, but you're talking about planter strips to the edges of the roadway, correct? Is that what you're envisioning?
They can vary. Typically, they're between the sidewalk and the curb. Predominantly, as you know, the city does not have fully developed rights of way, curb, gutter, sidewalk. Sometimes there's no shoulder. But there are sections on shore that have planter strips between the sidewalk and the lane of travel. If those words aren't added, it would be ambiguous in the code whether they are landscape. So in that sense, it's not sidewalk, but they're very much a right-of-way improvement. So it clarifies that. And it does not conflict with what I see as legal temporary code law. It goes hand in hand with the safety, line of sight, use of public right of way, and city's discretion. Now, there aren't many here in Lake Forest Park, but there are some.
Councilmember Lee.
So it may seem counterintuitive, but I would allow temporary signs in the planter strips. As an example, real estate signs. So if you don't put them in the sidewalk, but you want to indicate where the house is for sale, you're only then left with areas that have sidewalks to put it into the planter strip.
Yeah, there may be areas that don't have undeveloped right of way, and then there's private property line, and realtor signs are a good example. Temporary sign in the right of way directs you to a sale.
Right.
Right. And the only option would be to ask that homeowner, can I put my for sale sign in your yard?
Yeah.
And so by calling out planter strips as acceptable, then you're clarifying the ambiguity. They would be allowed between the curb and the sidewalk.
Right, but these sections refer to places that you cannot place a temporary sign.
Exactly. And they're
So-
different than roundabouts and medians. So if
Right.
522 gets a median,
Right.
that's not a planter strip.
So I would not add the words planter strip or beds.
Yeah, this, go ahead.
So I have a clarifying question. If you were to go to the corner there of Ballinger and Bothell Way, those corners, that's a fairly common place for people to put up temporary signs. Would those like those corners count as planter strips, or like what would the classification of those corners be?
For code enforcement, we'd have to declare them something since they're part of the roundabout. I would tend towards that. It's a right-of-way safety improvement in the public right-of-way.
Well, just to, not the roundabout, the intersection right there by the traffic light.
Yeah, they're all elements of the roundabout.
So what you're saying is that based on this language, all of those signs there would be prohibited.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant because that is a fairly common place for people to put signs up. It's high visibility. I don't know that it is a safety hazard if it's far enough from the roadway itself. So I would like there to be a little more flexibility about people being able to put up temporary signs.
Planning Commission's recommendation is to prohibit them.
Go ahead.
I concur with my colleague. I think there are going to be some places that are high visibility. There is pedestrian access to that center triangle piece so that pedestrians can get to it safely. I think the concern about allowing them in the median is you got to run across the road to get to the median. I think we're trying to avoid the sort of the danger of that as well as the clutter of the signage. I'm okay with planter strips and improved right of way being places where you can put these temporary signs. And then, for instance, here where there's there's legal pedestrian access to that island, that to me, that shouldn't be excluded from temporary signs.
I would just keep in mind that temporary signs, and you can't read the message, code enforcement, I'm not pulling any signs. Or I'm pulling all signs, but would not want staff to be in a position of having to pull some signs from the roundabout.
Yeah.
No
not the real
definition
route.
that some are appropriate and some aren't, because we're going to a world where temporary sign is the sign type. So, and we do have a lot where event signs get pulled. People are really well behaved, but you see them out there. Currently, you can read it. Well, no, currently you can't read it, but our code doesn't capture that. But it could be anything from, re-roof, paint, dogs for sale, political sign, all the old names of sign, election sign, farmer's market. The sign type will be temporary and we will enforce whatever the council puts into the ordinance.
I feel like we need to honor the public forum of public spaces while maintaining safety for both pedestrians and vehicles. And yes, sometimes things happen in a public forum that isn't, well received by everybody, but it is a public forum out there on the roadways. So yeah, if it's a safe place that pedestrian can get to, there's access by a marked crosswalk. To me, that would be a place where we should allow. And yes, we may run into some unfortunate signs, but that's just.
That can be done with the council consensus. The position we'll put us in is we'd still be exercising the safety. And
Absolutely.
we'd have to do it uniformly. So what constitutes acceptable safety on the roundabout or the triangle and so forth would also have to constitute acceptable safety on a sleepy street or a busy street or something on the other side of the city. We can achieve that. We can achieve fairness, but then we're susceptible to comments. Other people's opinions. Why here? Why not there? Well, if you did it there, then why not here? And so it's site specific. We're trying to make this as uniform as possible.
I think perhaps something like a marked crosswalk could give us a starting point as a very neutral yes or no from the staff to be able to determine whether it's safe or not.
I would be fine if we just say, you can't put signs in planter strips or medians between lanes of traffic.
That would be linked to safety.
Yeah.
So if I can ask, recalling the planning commission's reasoning on this, was it about safety?
Having not been there, it's hard to nail it down, but I think it's a blend of safety and sign noise, sign pollution. And still honoring First Amendment and fair, open discussion in the public, but maximizing safety.
Yeah, of course, we want to honor, of course, the work the planning commission put into these revisions, and knowing a little bit of their reasoning helps. So thanks. All right, we ready to move on? We got a head nod on the median thing. Okay. All right, so moving on to removal timing.
This is the one timing issue. Right now, it currently reads 10 days. There wasn't a lot of discussion, but that's where the planning commission landed. We're seeing better results than 10, fortunately. I think at 5 would be a more community-friendly number. It's pretty strict, but it gets attention, gets results. And in those times where if we were to see something not being done, it's easier for us to enforce after 5 days than 10. The unintended consequence, I always try and look at, those community events that are somewhat more about awareness than they are that day of event or sales. I'm not sure the benefit they would get by having 10 days versus 5, but that's a possibility.
Mhm.
The intent is the event's over, please remove them, and then deciding on a point where we would start enforcing.
Okay. Oh, sorry. What did
Will
we do?
do. Remind me, because we got bits and pieces of the code here, remind me, how early can you put out a temporary sign before an event? Is that dictated right now? I can't remember.
In 2 places, there's exempt signs, prohibited signs, and then temporary signs, and then each zone has its own. So you're primarily the public right of way, the event, so 90 or 30 days, you could have a temporary sign in some situations. On your, I'd have to look at it.
So there's still a time for an event sign to be out significantly before an event to get the information out. It's just after the event, we just want them to clear them out rather efficiently. I think in that sense, 5 days works with me. As long as it's specifically tied to a dated event.
Councilmember Goldman?
And we are allowed
Sorry.
to do that. I'm no lawyer, as you know. Reed versus Gilbert, and then the Ninth Circuit, and then the Austin case. The Ninth Circuit very much applies to non-commercial. The Austin case, you get some leeway because for off-site signs, you need to read the sign. So there is smaller risk to read a sign like that, or is to read a temporary political sign.
I just want to get clarity. If we have a recurring event, so for instance, the farmer's market, which is every Sunday for about 5 months, does that count as one 5-month-long event, or is that a whole bunch of weekly events?
For permitting purposes, if they obtained a permit and cited their dates, I think we would allow it. For allowed without a permit, they would have to call each one an event.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're not going into a place where all the farmers market signs have to be out by Thursday because that's or Friday because that's 5 days after, but then they can put it back because now it's the day before the next one.
I wouldn't know because I couldn't read it. It's a temporary sign in a parking lot, or it's a temporary sign in the right of way. And then I would go to that applicable code. I cannot read, it's the farmer's market this weekend and that weekend, and that's the hurdle that we're at. But taking into account that if the council was willing to assume some risk, that's your discretion.
I mean, I guess where I'm at is if there was, I don't know if we're allowed to put it in, but if we could say, if events are linked, they could be counted as a single event. So like all the farmers markets combined would count as one event for the purposes of timing when the signs are up.
I'd have to look at it. To me, that means that their window is shorter. If you look at it flexibly and 5 different events, then those timelines are independent. But I'm not going to do sign math, as you say, on the screen.
Councilmember Leva?
I think we're fine if we just say they remove them within 5 days. So in practical terms, for the farmer's market, because it's every week, what'll happen is you have an event for Sunday, you advertise for Sundays, 5 days or whatever in advance. Well, then 1 week later, you just say, well, I've got my sign up in advance for the next week. So you're not actually having to remove it because the time period is so short that it doesn't really matter. Now, if they had an event once a month, then again, you probably have a certain flexibility because I don't have to remove it within 5 days because it's really the sign for the next event. I'm not sure. I think
Well,
that's fine.
the simple structure is great for enforcement. With a special event permit that we sign and look at, we could approve a sign program. So I'm not worried about that
Yeah.
style because I don't have to read the sign. I just read the special event permit.
So with the 5 to 10 days, I'd be in favor of the 5 days. But I don't think that in practical terms, it would make a difference for the farmer's market. They pull up the signs on Sunday afternoon
Pretty
anyway.
good about that. All right, anybody else with it?
I'm in favor of 5 days.
I am as well.
I think we got the head nod. All right, the budding owner approval. So it is, I'm not sure what the change here was because it wasn't highlighted. Is it the whole thing?
Without getting into the scenario of if somebody puts a sign on your property, what are your rights to retain or remove it? That's not what this is. In the section dealing with public rights of way, what this attempts to deal with is code enforcement or the call we inevitably get in the right of way. There's a sign, I don't support it. Can I remove it? It may be that the answer's we don't know because we can't remove it. We can't read it. It's a temporary sign and it pertains to seemingly to an election and it'll be removed within 5 days. What this does is it acknowledges that there is an obligation or a courtesy that it's recommended that you get the abutting property owner's permission. We don't track it, we don't require it, but it's there and it sure is handy when you need it.
I guess, I'll ask my question, which is, I'm assuming it's a new section then. Or it's
Very new.
Okay,
Yeah, it's
okay,
in the
got it.
category of reading through the planning commission's recommendations, trying to envision all the, reasonable or appropriate situations and then filling those gaps proactively.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure quite how I feel. Part of me is thinking that if a sign is in the public right of way, it belongs to the public rather than one homeowner who happens to be adjacent to that spot. So I'm unsure that we would want to give the abutting owner some sort of veto power if they don't like the sign, if it is in the public space. I mean, I get that it does say recommended, so it's not required. But I wouldn't want to see people empowered to say, oh, I live next to the curb where this sign is up, therefore I can pull it out because I don't like the sign. I don't think we should be encouraging that.
Well, it's a courtesy and especially in a city like this. A majority of the streets are residential. They're not curb gutter and sidewalk. There is an allowance for landscaping use of that right of way with certain criteria. And that causes the public parking issue in many neighborhoods. As you're driving through and signs are put up, in many instances, they're random. Dentist office, roof cleaning, you name it. I'm not allowed to read them. The property owner, if they are acting within the code, would call because they would know where the right-of-way line is. Most often they do not, and they view that as their property. If not viewing it as their property, they view it as, I caretake that area. And so that's what this is intended to do. There's no requirement in any way. If someone were to call and say, did they indeed get that abutting property owner's permission, I would say, I don't know, but it's recommended. And so it's a courtesy. It's a way of bringing the issue out so that you just can't randomly place signs.
So, Mayor?
I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but right-of-way issues are something that we've had to deal with in the past. The state Supreme Court and the courts have upheld continuously that, and I'll read the citation. The state Supreme Court noted the general rule that in the absence of a governing statute or reservation in the grant, the owner of the land on each side of the street owns the fee to the center of the street, subject only to the easement to the public. So the assumption is that the abutting property owner has the right to have some input on what is occurring within that section of the road. I just want to put that there,
Mhm.
put that out there because it's something that's come up in the past for your edification. Kim can clarify that a lot more than I can.
Okay. So, oh, go ahead.
I'm in favor of inserting that approval of a budding property owner. Because it is true when people are taking care of their planter strip and someone comes and puts a sign in it, and if they don't agree with it, it can cause problems. So I think it gives the ability to mediate it, maybe, right?
It makes it clearer in the
Makes it
sense that
clear.
it doesn't add staff burden. You know, we're not adding a sign planner to enforce
Right.
abutting property owner permission or anything like that, but it's a way of at least trying for voluntary compliance.
Mhm.
I'm in favor of adding it.
Right, Councilmember Riddle.
Do we require, and I think we do, all temporary signs to have some way of identifying who put them up? So there's some sort of way of contacting the people who put up the temporary sign.
We do not, and I've not seen a code that deals with that. I
So-
have frequent flyers in the past that abuse the code. We pull the sign, we keep it at City Hall. This is a scenario, not here. Keep it at City Hall for 30 days. They can come claim it. We can give them some information on the code. Keeps happening. We ramp it up. And then eventually it's clear there's abuse. What are the avenues available to the city for this violation? But all those attempts in between do not require us to call or even know who put the sign up. It's going to be more difficult now because I'm not supposed to read the copy.
Yeah, so what I was thinking is that part of this approval of a budding owner, it would be useful if we required some sort of contact information on these temporary signs, so the owner can then call and say, can you just move this to another location? And maybe the city can stay out of it and it can stay cordial between the two parties. And we're not then inserting ourselves into that conversation unless they can't come to a resolution.
I mean,
It's also nice to know who's putting up the signs, but that's
Right.
another topic.
Councilmember Lee, you have thoughts on that?
I understand that this is it's a recommendation,
Mhm.
and so enforcement of it is kind of in a gray area. Is there a problem we're trying to solve?
I think it, and this is just my opinion, I think it's creating a problem because it starts wandering into copy on a temporary sign. And that's exactly where we're trying to get away from.
Well, I think that there were concerns about certain political signs being in front of homes that were opposite their political sort of preference. And so there was a feeling that it may be people thought they put it up and it made them feel uncomfortable. And this is something I remember hearing from previous elections. So that's probably the only thing we're trying to solve with this.
So just to follow up, is there a staff recommendation here?
I can make one, yeah, based on my understanding of Reed versus Gilbert and my non-attorney understanding of strict construction, I would stay away from any copy. It's no longer a political sign, and our enforcement is already there in keeping with case by case Reed versus Gilbert, and that is we do not read the sign.
Right, but the question here was whether or not we should insert language that a recommendation to get approval of the adjacent property owner for these kinds of, is that a
Oh,
staff recommendation?
That is a staff recommendation.
I'm fine with that, because as a recommendation, it's a recommendation. It's not.
Often you reach that point where you can't take an action, you can't do the next step, but at least having that in there raises awareness. It decreases the number of times where that occurs, and it's easier to deal with those that, to explain to somebody what that balance is because it's in there, that we are doing it. Otherwise, without it, they walk away saying there's no control for that situation. Please have that control. This is the happy medium. I have the control, but it's a recommendation. It's a balance.
I guess I would just wonder if there's a way, again, because we're not able to read copy, that we can just sort of stay out of it and allow there to be a mechanism for homeowners to say, I don't, I don't appreciate this in the right of way in front of my home, and be able to just contact the individual or company that put the sign there and have them move it. And we stay out of it altogether simply because
Yeah,
we've
that's-
added something in our policy saying that you have to have a way to contact the owner of a temporary sign.
In theory, they have that ability, but my perspective is from staff and code enforcement.
Right.
I
'Cause
would
as I
feel for
understand
them,
it,
but I couldn't instruct them to call the roofer or call the
Right.
candidate. That's private.
Right, because you had to read the content of the sign at that point, so.
So yeah, for strict construction, the primary intent of these amendments is to meet Reed versus Gilbert.
Yeah.
And then there are certain balances or flexibilities that you could pursue that some jurisdictions are successful at.
Right.
But the copy or what the sign
Mhm.
says is clearly not for us to use in our discretion.
So I'm gonna give my take on this, which is that given what the mayor just said, reading about the what the Supreme Court's decided, it does seem that then right now the property owner could just literally tear up the sign with no repercussion. It's that we're putting this in here to solve the problem of incivility that might entail. So I'm thinking that basically, you're trying to shine a light on this issue. We're putting this in here as, hey, you might want to talk to the property owner before you do this, before you get your sign torn off the ground and thrown in the street or whatever. So is that incorrect?
From staff's code enforcement, city responsibility perspective, yes.
Okay. Right. Threading a needle there. Thank you. All right. Do we have a head nod on this one then?
What? I support it.
I support it
Okay.
in favor.
I
Yeah.
support it to the extent that it is a recommendation rather than a requirement.
Right. Okay. Yeah, what you need? All right. Okay, next part, quantity of signs allowed in the right of way. No more than 6 signs.
This was brought up every time in the year I've been here. We've brought signs to you as a possibility that you could amend it. I cannot say exactly why the planning commission chose 6. This is a broad city with a lot of public right of way. And I can't read the sign copy. So it would be difficult for me to count the number of signs that somebody put in the right of way citywide. That's the first difficulty. Second, 6 seems restrictive for many different scenarios, elections being primary. I've never seen a citywide number placed on them. Sign pollution, safety, and so forth. And then the assumption is wherever else is available is available. If you want to pay for 200 signs and put them tastefully where they go in the right of way, those are the codes that I've implemented. So, but I cannot speak exactly to why Planning Commission chose 6, other than trying to limit sign noise, sign pollution.
Comments? Go ahead.
I would offer that we delete the number of signs permitted. If you think about, you can't read copy, every sign is white.
Right.
So try and discern whether those are your 6 white signs or Joe's 6 white signs. Because you can't read copy, every sign looks exactly the same.
I agree, and I think this would also address some of the public comment we got from the Secret Garden tour, that events like that it's a one-off event, but it is sort of a citywide one-off event, that not putting a limit on how many signs they could have, like wayfinding signs for the tour, I think would be helpful. So yeah, I support deleting the limit.
Go ahead.
And even if community can read the signs, they'll just put out different signs for the same, and so if there's complaints, then you can't even verify the complaint because they're all white signs. So yeah, I think it just causes too much trouble.
It's a white sign of X square feet, this high and this down. Yes, you're correct.
Yeah, so I would just agree, strike.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree
Please-
with that.
Please convey to the planning commission that we understand the reasoning behind why they wanted this, but if we're trying to comply with Reed, this is just not going to work. So, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, moving on, temporary sign size in the public right of way.
This is the start of the two issues that you heard from Randy. We talked about this previously last year and then caught up to confirm, so it's in my memo. This industry standard being at 4 instead of 3 would take care of that type of temporary sign. The other one brought up is the on-site. That now that I say it, it brings up another issue, but the intent is on-site real estate arm that supports a sign of 5 square feet, and we have a maximum height. My intent is to measure to the top of the sign. And that's to prevent huge sign bulk or some serious exaggeration, but it would accommodate the industry standard for that sign. As soon as I said that, it brought up the situation with the right of ways where I won't say what proportion, but many homeowners view that front landscaped area that's unpaved as maybe they don't own it and it's right away, but they certainly have responsibility for it if it snows or there's a danger. So there's that some degree of ownership there. And I wouldn't want to be in a position of surveying to figure out where the property line is to make sure this arm sign is behind the property line on private property. I don't have a fix at this moment, but it's for the category of temporary sign in the right of way and making sure those numbers work for the 5 square feet and 5 foot height. So if this is acceptable, this is an example of looking through the code again for all those other citations to make sure they're consistent. So I would go back to definitions, prohibited signs, permitted signs, temporary signs, and then each zone to make sure that's consistent so that industry standard can be met both in front of the house and on their property.
So questions or comments? Go ahead.
So just to clarify, so I'm looking at the bottom of page 2 of 3, temporary signs in the public right of way, where it talks about square footage. Is that the reference that you're referring to?
The language is on this page,
Because when you go to the language on the next page, though,
right?
it talks about a sign exempt, blah, 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 displayed for 30 days or fewer in a 1-year period. I'm not clear on which sign we're referring to that can only be displayed for 30 days or fewer in a year.
Before this discussion, it was an easy fix. It would have been under a different section, changing 3 to 5 square feet and the height. I can't recite that section, but to go back to this would be an example for an arm sign in the public right of way. This would have to be increased to 5 and 5 as well, because it's a temporary sign. I can't call it a real estate sign. So as we make these decisions on the individual sections,
Okay,
it may have ramifications.
that's fine. But then when I turn the page, the highlighted section in red, not clear to me what that 30 days is referring to. To give you an example, if you have a sign for an event such as a primary, is that sign counted for those 30 days leading up to the primary? And then the general election is another 30 days, so it's not the same 30 days. And if you have a for sale sign on a house that doesn't sell within 30 days, do they have to remove the sign? And I would hope not, that the for sale sign may remain in industry standards until they choose to take it off the market or it sells. But I would also be in favor of, you oftentimes see that a house has sold. There's a benefit to the real estate agent to advertise that the house has sold. Now, I don't know what the industry standard is that for 5 days, or do they leave it up for 2 weeks? And again, I wouldn't want to get into saying, well, the industry should benefit from it. And I don't want to be restrictive to say, nope, you can't advertise that you sold the house, because I think that's is a benefit to the real estate agent and everyone for the sale of the house.
So, where it comes up in the March 27th materials is signs in multifamily residential and single family in residential. The First Amendment is, no. Anyway, when I turn the page, it's not there. So I'll read my note. Page 12.
So my comment is I'm okay with what we see as already general practice in what, whether they be political or real estate.
For 30 days. We'll have to look at it. I won't do
Okay.
this on
Okay.
camera, but those would have to be made consistent because they're both temporary signs. And I believe if we go that route with the two suggestions, it will have ramifications to the temporary sign chapter, whether it's 90 days or 38 days, they'll need to be made consistent, which likely means the numbers elsewhere in this chapter go up. But it would accommodate that range of temporary signs that we are accustomed to.
Good.
There is also permitted signs,
Correct.
which could still be temporary, but permitted to be outside of the temporary sign requirements. So size, duration can all be worked with the city in a permitted sign. Is that?
To some extent,
To
yes.
some extent.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at doing a permitted sign for a real estate for sale sign that's going to be up there for an unknown amount of time, and you want to have it left up there for some unknown, would that be something that could be done within a permitted sign environment with like an open-ended?
It can be, but it would be on par with our tree permits. There's many of these. In a downturn, there's too many of these. And so what I'm trying to do is strike the balance where those industry standard signs are accommodated in those natural processes. Leave the permitting for the higher category and then have the relief valve for the variance and so forth. And I would argue, without reading copy, this type of sign for that industry and that process should be accommodated in the permitted temporary sign standards. As written, that means that the restrictive temporary sign standards elsewhere are probably going to need to go to 5 and 5. But I'll catch all those and reread it and make it consistent for the public hearing.
Because I think it would be interesting to think about a permitted temporary signs for, for the farmer's market where it's a reoccurring thing. So we basically have kind of a master temporary signage agreement that this is what we've agreed to is how often they'll be out. It can be tailored, and perhaps, for real estate agents and brokers, it could be something similar. We don't really have that kind of permit figured out here, but almost like a standing permit,
Now, one thing this doesn't really get into is our permitting review, right? This is sign code and anything related is permitting and intakes and fees somewhat related. Yeah. But this was not an analysis of what those type 3 or ministerial type decisions could be. If and when we get there and we adjust those, they still would need to be consistent with not reading copy. But then you get into the realm of the permitting. To some extent, you have to start reading copy because you need to know what it is, the event, location, things like that. But I would offer to enter into that incrementally and slowly so that we could find that right balance. But what this is not is an examination of those permit relief valves for bigger than currently permitted.
Yeah, I think getting the rest of this taken care of now, but maybe the council can consider what that might look like. Just to ease that reoccurring sort of events, whether it's the sale of a home or the farmer's market, secret garden, that they know and they have an agreement with the city that this is how we're going to be going about it. But that would be later.
So you okay with this now then?
I think I'm okay with this for now.
Okay.
I just think we do need a better process later.
Councilmember Golden.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that same place that in terms of the size of the sign, I'm totally fine going up to 5 square feet or whatever we would need to accommodate standard signs. Where I'm struggling is in paragraph 7, non-permitted signs have a 30-day limit. And then in paragraph 8, permitted signs have a 60-day limit. And I'm struggling. I think if earlier we were talking about that, it has to be 5 days after the end of the event, X days before the beginning of the event. And I feel that kind of takes care of the duration of the sign. I don't know that we need the 30 and the 60, especially for recurring things like the farmer's market or primary plus general election, that if they already have a defined start and ending, then that kind of sets the duration for that sign.
So just to elaborate, so for example, you couldn't set up a for sale sign more than 30 days before you offer the home for sale. But the event runs until it sells, and so the duration then is 5 days after it sells, whatever that duration is.
That's
I
correct.
just wanna
That's
be-
where we're getting towards.
I just
Now,
wanna
the
be
cure for
careful.
that is to back those off individually to get to a uniform code that's more, one thing or the other. But dealing with these intricacies then makes those conflicts.
Yeah, I don't want to be in a place where we have to permit for sale signs for a home.
Staff does not want to either. But then the unforeseen circumstances, then the size and the height have to be incorporated in under that sign type. We can make that thorough.
Right. Right.
And then call it copy-free administration of the code. Deal with those issues as they come up and tweak them as one-offs in code cleanup. But then this would be the basis, and then we could start looking at what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. So
So would we need to strike the 30 days or less in any 1 year period then on
Yeah.
line 7?
It may be,
Yes.
it may be that to address those kinds of issues, that any duration should be looked at.
Yeah.
And I don't see that as substantive, that we need to go back and redo the environmental review or commerce review, because this is more restrictive and that is coming away from that a little bit.
Right.
But what we do need to do is have a consensus before the public hearing,
Mhm.
where the danger becomes you shift something, and to be on the safe side, redo the public hearing.
So are we kind of leaning in towards temporary signs and permitted signs? The only differentiator is the size. But temporary signs have a smaller cap than permitted signs. Is that kind of the only difference now, if we get rid of durations?
Yes.
Okay,
But I would be okay that the sign can't be more than 30 days in advance of the event. And I would say that on a house sale, you're not putting the sign up more than 30 days before the house is on the market. But once it's on the market until it sells.
Sometimes longer.
Right. And so in effect, you can put up a sign when you offer it for sale and it remains in place until it sells,
Yeah. Now,
whatever that duration is.
whatever ends up in the public hearing draft ordinance and whatever's adopted, that would be the intent of the enforcement. And if we haven't nailed the wording and it's in a gray area, we can come up with better wording in the future, but it would have to be consistent with the structure that we're building.
So for example, if you have a garden tour or rented a park, you may say the sign may not go up more than 30 days before the event.
That would be the intent. Now, my understanding is that we're Reed versus Gilbert amending this.
Yeah.
Then there are other opportunities, off-site, non-commercial signs, for instance, events, you have to read them. And the other case law supports that to some extent. Some cities take more risks than others. I think that's a safe risk. That's my opinion. It's certainly in codes that aren't being challenged and it's being implemented in the region. So it's not a no-touch issue. It's how would you like it here in this community? And having no duration, but being able to read the event and control those. And then 5 days or fewer removed,
Yeah.
that would be a good balance.
So where are we landing on this? We landing on basically just getting rid of the duration, keeping the area, or are we going to keep the duration as well for now?
I would propose, as Director Hoffman has suggested, that in essence, we delete it.
I
Yeah.
think we delete the duration.
Okay, so both the 30 and the 60.
Yeah.
I
Go
have a
ahead.
clarification. What does, if we delete the 30 days, what does paragraph 7 say then? Because all it would say is that a sign exempt from permitting because it is no greater than, let's say, 5 square feet, period. But so there's no, like, it's not clear what that paragraph is requiring or prohibiting.
It's saying that it's a sign type permitted by right in the right of way.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it says temporary signs are permitted upon meeting the following conditions. So it'd be just one of those conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
But-
think it could be made consistent with deleting the 30
Right.
days.
It doesn't have to be a sentence.
Just because like all the others have like a shall or a shall not. Like it shall be put here or shall not be put there. And then this is just saying it, maybe it should be a sign is exempt from permitting if it's smaller than X square feet. It just seems like without the durational requirement, that paragraph 7 isn't adding any sort of requirement to what makes for a temporary sign.
No, it shouldn't be, because you have that prior in the chapter, you have the temporary sign section. And then you have these succeeding chapters that apply it to specific zones and the public right of way. So the 7, I think you're referring to, is that those signs are allowed in the public right of way.
So this temporary sign size in the public right of way, that would only be changed from 4 square feet to 5 square feet? And that would be it?
Right.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and so the way this would read is just starting from the beginning it's section A of 1852-080. In the public right of way, temporary signs are permitted upon meeting the following conditions. There's a bunch of them. A sign exempt from permitting that section because it is no greater than 3 square feet. So that sign would be allowed. Okay.
3 would be changed to 5. 5 foot height, or 4 would be changed to 5, 30 days deleted in number 7.
I agree. It's not the best wording in the world, but yeah.
The challenge is going to be getting all those thoroughly through all of these code sections. I'll commit the time to that. Because the intent is to schedule and hold a public hearing. I think I can produce a public hearing draft that captures the consensus. Then we can notice and hold the public hearing. Amendments can still be made there, but then it's a case of, as those amendments are made, somebody will have to determine whether they're substantive. But we can do that.
Right. Thanks. Go ahead.
I was ready to move on if there are an opportunity to make other comments.
Yes, go ahead.
So on a construction site, you oftentimes see a variety of signs: no trespassing, personal protection requirements, or their job site requirements. And I don't see anywhere in the code that would permit those signs.
They're not prohibited. They'd be under temporary signs. I can't recall the exact thing. I would give the impression the last 3 times I've read it, that scenario would be regulated, but allowed.
Okay, so
Oftentimes
the
it'll be an
duration,
architect.
because we've removed the duration, it would be for the event, which is the entirety
Yeah.
of the construction.
And it's hard to avoid that issue if you can't read the sign, but if the purpose is safety,
Yeah.
or it's required by OSHA, this
Yeah.
is not an attempt to regulate those.
Okay.
So most of the time, those types of signs would be on a fence, but we've prohibited temporary signs on fences. And a lot of businesses, homes, they have a fence, and that is where they can put a temporary sign. They put it on their property, it's on the other side of the fence, no one can see it, which is not really useful for sign presentation. So I don't know about the unintended consequences if we just strike on, that it's prohibited on fences, so they can be on fences. Fences are specifically on private property, otherwise it's in the wrong place. So it's up to that private homeowner, how they want to handle their fence. So I guess I'm thinking this through in some of the situations that my colleague brought up about construction. I think we should strike on fences. So that's page 6.
Right.
1852-045C2 for temporary signs and allow them on fences.
Oh, go ahead.
Because, I think would be fine, but I'm also hearing you that if, for example, safety signs for safety purposes or OSHA or WISHA are not regulated by this.
They're not prohibited.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of afraid of is what are the unintended consequences of striking that, right? So, and I don't think we have enough time to explore necessarily. Do you have a comment, Councilmember Lebo or Councilmember Good?
I guess I never assumed that those were actually signs that were on fences. They look like notices to me.
From my memory, the first reading, that scenario I definitely thought of. The most extreme is somebody pays a lot of money for a new fence. That contractor loves to put his little emblem symbol on there. It's like a maker's mark. I don't think this intends to regulate those. It's not that extreme. It's incidental. Now, I think it lies in the definitions where that is dealt with. But I think as written, it gives staff the discretion or bandwidth to focus on what signs are by the definitions as opposed to these incidentals. So, and commercial is very taken care of. That's clear. The city is very taken care of, stop signs and so forth. I would offer that as written, it's not a big issue and it's adequate.
So, go ahead.
This is for the council. There's a provision here that if you have a home occupation, you're not allowed to have a sign advertising your home occupation.
Mhm.
So for example, if you're an attorney or a CPA, this, as written, as I understand, you can't put up a sign that says, I'm Joe CPA. And that's not very business friendly.
No. And it's also content specific.
Now, I would offer that's not a change. It's consistent with the home occupation regulations. I can't state why that's the case, but the regulations for home occupation are in a different chapter. Specifically say no signs. This is consistent with that and no amendments are proposed.
The question is, does the council want to entertain a motion that would allow somebody who's got a home occupation to advertise that they do?
Yeah, well, we would have to untangle all the parts of the MC that have the references to that, of course, but council, what's your pleasure?
My comment on homeowners or home businesses is that business owners have to provide parking for their patrons. And so how do you're saying that someone that rents a spot and hangs out a shingle can do it, but then the resident, or if you allow the resident to hang out a shingle, they don't have to comply to the same code that that another business owner does. That's the problem that I have with both of those two things, is that one has to require parking to be available and the other one, what would you do with that? That's my only question on
And
that.
the way our code treats this is home occupations are regulated. Why? Because they're an accessory use to an existing residential use.
Mhm.
Can't say single family anymore. Residential use. So in that sense, those regulations about parking or signage or the number of employees or outward appearance is very controlled by the home occupation regulations and the sign code in order to keep it as an accessory use. Once it rises above accessory, it's commercial. And you would need zoning for that. And then they would be subject to all of those regulations.
So that's my question, is that if you have if I have a business license and I'm a lawyer, but I'm practicing law out of my home, what makes, you know, what makes it different from the guy on the corner who has an actual rented spot? I mean, I know that's going around in a circle a little bit, but I'm not opposed to home businesses having a sign. I want that clear. I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying it gives more, I don't know, freedoms to one party than the other that are probably doing the same business.
If I may sort of interject something, is this something that we kick back to the planning commission? Because it is a lot more nuanced than we probably have time here for. Go ahead.
And I know that the legislature was looking at changing what can be done in these residential environments. And I think we should have a kind of a whole, even though that didn't pass, we should have a conversation internally, what we want to see in our city, what will be appropriate to be sort of embedded throughout the residential that's maybe it's just a CPA or something versus those that need lots of folks to be able to come through and need to be more regulated, whether that's a cafe or something like that. So I would punt that back to planning commission for them to work on for sure.
Okay. So, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I broadly concur. I think it's something that the planning commission wants to take up, is looking at ways to incentivize neighborhood scale commercial. And I think these changes to the sign code would fit into that, and because it is a big topic for us to try to work through right now. So I would also concur with asking the planning commission to look more broadly at neighborhood commercial.
Especially as it relates to parking, because while we want to allow our home businesses to flourish, a lot of our roadways don't allow for lots of parking.
That's fair.
If that's a consensus, it actually is a parking lot item of the planning commission.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
And I would offer as such, if they took a broad look at that list as a separate effort, and that we could leave the home occupation language alone for now until that happens, because then we're starting to really erode their recommendation and get to a point where at least the discussion is needed as to whether we start to redo SEPA and commerce.
I would be behind that. I would like to look at this home occupation signage, but it makes sense to do it in conjunction with that further discussion, whether it's a, you know.
As you say, it's the whole commercial development thing. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and whether it's gonna, how it impacts the difference between our neighborhood business core or that are distributed throughout versus neighborhood commercial core. There's just a lot to unpack. So yeah, I would delay addressing that item C until we have the rest taken care of.
Right. Are there any other points people want to bring up on the sign code? I'm assuming everybody's okay with the fewer versus less thing.
He's done the research.
Yep. I'm going to go with that. Yep. Okay.
I like it. Yeah, most wordsmithing on code doesn't get to the spot of considering grammatical issues. It's usually the industries or the attorneys, and it gets chunky, but I'm more than willing to look at grammatical issues and make this better.
Right. So do you have what you need from us?
Yes, let me relook at my list.
Okay.
Make sure we covered everything.
Oh, go ahead. Councilmember Goldman.
As I recall, weren't there two things that the public comment involving the Realtor brought up? I know we considered one, which was the sign area, but wasn't there a second one that you were going to bring up?
It's also area and height, but it was specific to the for sale arm sign. Either on, the comment was about on somebody's property, and that sign size is a temporary sign. And can we boost that to 5 square feet and 5 foot height to accommodate it? Then we added the discussion about those types of signs in the right of way. So that would address, if we go with those uniformly through the code as temporary signs at that size, that would address that second comment.
Okay.
But it also means that the first comment is 5 instead of 3.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we addressed both of those concerns.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
And then looking, so the 4 categories I had for tonight are city council changes
Mhm.
or anything new. Staff's items, 8, we have consensus on those. The 2, one of which is industry, so 2 issues from Randy. And then the amortization discussion. So I believe we have everything we need to then go away, modify the ordinance draft, try not to confuse everyone with all these versions, but prepare for and notice a public hearing based on that consensus and push that out for review with you. And then the other element, one of the notes at the very tail end of my memo was that it was requested on March 27th that once we get to that point and we have all these versions, the ordinance version, red line with strikeout, underline, the existing code, everything in between, my memo with 8 items, it gets a little confusing. Might be helpful then take the ordinance attachment, make those changes. And I believe it was your comment that said, then you could see if all this went well, what would the code look like minus all this red? So I'm willing to do that, but I was hoping to wait until we get to a point where the wordsmithing was kind of nailed down a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think you have it, but we started the discussion with the sign code allowing the kinds of banners that we see in the town center area now, whether it be Chase in their grand opening or Safeway in their grand opening, as well as the garden tour, that they could put up the temporary banners and the street or the light pole banners being larger than what the code currently permits, so that they are distinguishable in terms of legibility.
No, and March 27th, I brought that up knowing that it was right out there in the parking lot.
Yeah.
The current code allows that. It's a freely, I don't even know. what
Right,
they're
the
called.
current, but the
Yeah.
marked up version doesn't.
And now the worked up version restricts that.
And I think what we heard from the council was we would be, that we'd like to see this revision allow what we see out there today.
And the note that I wrote was more in line with a grand opening.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As opposed to a new sign type or messing with the language about flags, balloons and air guys, but then bring back an element about grand opening for a certain period of time that would accommodate what you're saying for Chase and Safeway.
Okay, and then the temporary banners for fun in the park and the garden tour, that those banners could be then put up.
That's gonna be a little harder. My note says, relook at banners. So I'll sit with the new code, definition of banner, temporary sign, see how it could be interpreted as written, and then see a scenario on how we could accommodate specific types without special treatment as to what they are.
Okay.
So it's primarily events.
Okay, but then also just increasing the available size of banners on poles. They
Now,
seem a little
that
small.
sign program stays. So only half of what you see out there would be prohibited. The little metal attachments you see to the light pole
Yeah,
with those banners,
yeah.
those are allowed and will be allowed.
Can they be made larger?
I don't know the size they're at, but they are regulated to a certain size and you only get 25 poles. So that's where it's going, but if we could look at that in the sense, I wouldn't want it ambiguous,
Right.
right? Nor would I want to say, are restricted to the size they currently are. So we'll
Right.
need a number.
Right.
Okay.
So you're gonna
But
go
I
measure
think-
them?
But I thought I heard from one of the public comments to make them larger. And
Right. But we need a size then, so, yeah.
I'm open to a recommendation
Yeah.
to make them larger.
I was gonna offer to help you go measure these things.
I'm not gonna- It'd be like, well, that looks like it's about 2 by 3 inches.
They'll know, and they just went up, that they haven't been finalized on their permit. Their signs have been finalized, but the final inspection won't be signed off and handed to them until that's meets code.
All right, so then, so I guess, given all these things that need to be fixed up, we're probably not ready to schedule the public hearing yet?
I think we are, and so
We are,
the
okay.
freshness of this, I don't know if I'll get it right. And we have that flexibility to make slight amendments after the public hearing. That's a given. The city attorney will be here to help make determinations about whether that's substantive. would require a new public hearing, would require a new SEPA, et cetera. I think we're heading in the right direction. I would like to hold a notice of public hearing May 8th.
Yes.
That we would need to know this week because we would start the notice.
Right. Okay, so you'll get back to at least the leadership team on that then?
Yeah, I'm gonna work on it right away
Okay.
because it's fresh. If I wait a week, then I start forgetting. I have to watch the video.
Go ahead.
It is, we have to get the latest draft out a certain number of days before the public hearing, 7 days?
When the notice goes out, I
Yeah.
believe 14 days,
14 days.
that hearing version has to exist.
That's the end of this week.
Yeah, and
Okay.
these are slight amendments, in my opinion. Right, they don't change the regulation of signs as I see it, but they are amendments. And so I would stick to, if the public notice goes out, here's the version that's subject to the public hearing. And I think I could achieve that and leave flexibility for further amendments or direction. Now, then again, if we hold a public hearing and we're not in a position to take action in the meeting after, there's nothing forcing you to take action.
Mhm.
If the copy that you bring us wasn't kind of like what we expected, can we just postpone the public hearing? Or do we, because we've said it, we have to go through with it? Just in case we look at it and go, oops, that's not what we thought.
Well, I'd hate to waste the work. I have canceled public hearings before. Then there's
Frustrating.
a debt of why.
Mhm.
So logistically, that's horrible. But if that were to come up, that's your discretion.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a big enough substantive difference that would impact,
Oh, yeah,
public
no.
hearing, then we can,
In your opinion, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I would offer is I wouldn't make those kind of amendments. The amendments we discussed in the consensus, I don't feel are that. They're in some ways backing off of the proposed recommendation. So in my world, that would not cause redo of the SEPA review.
Mhm.
Commerce barely reviews signs, but
they
to
do.
the extent they represent Growth Management Act, they do. And nobody commented from any of the state agencies. So I think we're safe, but we just have to be cognizant of that possibility. I think it's more important to hear from the industry
Mhm.
and getting those types of things right in our fine tuning.
Perfect. Okay.
All right, anybody have anything else? Well, thank you so much, Director Hoffman. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
We're looking forward to the amendments when they come back. Okay, so we're gonna mark that on your calendars. We're gonna close off tonight with a discussion regarding budget challenges. We'll try to do it in the next 15 minutes. But this discussion of course by nature is open-ended, but what I'd like to kind of confine us to is we just worked with the budget. We did the biennial budget last year, and all of you were present. And I'm wondering, we've now had time to assess both the cuts we made plus the new revenue that we generated, and wondering basically if that's going to be enough to carry us into the future. So with that preface, if you'd like to comment about the assessment, please do so. Like, for instance, let me toss something out there. Did we basically trim everything we could possibly trim?
No.
Good.
No, and as you recall, I believe that, climate issues are important to us, but we are using some of our revenue enhancement to pay for a climate change coordinator. And I don't know that that represents, and we saw from the survey of the community, the highest priority for expenditure of our limited resources.
Go ahead.
But I do think that we should reach out to our community for investments, and I think those need to be perhaps better articulated. Investments such as our infrastructure, whether it be stormwater, sewer. We have an aging infrastructure that's not been well invested in. We also have investments that we've needed, but we can afford right now only because we're dipping into the reserves, into the unallocated contingency, such as assets for our public works and our police department for vehicles. So we're basically using the unallocated contingency for those expenditures. And I would be in favor of asking the public to say, do they want to contribute to that through other means than using our general fund, for which we do have issues and our ability to support our staffing levels, whether they be in parks or administrative or police.
Fair. Good. Councilmember Good.
My comment is not on saving money, but trying to encourage more revenue. And if we're going to be talking about home businesses and signs and things like that, I think that there should be more requirement for those home businesses to be licensed by the city. So we know where they are, because it doesn't make sense for someone to hang out a shingle that is promoting a business and that they don't have a license in the city, which they operate.
That's fair. So just a follow-up question for you. So you're speaking of things also like the temporary short-term stay type places as well, like Airbnb is?
Yes,
Mhm.
they're, because as a business owner, if you're doing a temporary short-term stay, you're required to have additional insurance. You're required to do a lot of other things. And whether it's you're operating as an LLC or you're operating as a sole proprietor, those are still things that are, the insurance definitely is deducted as a tax for a business. So why is there no requirement for a license in the city they're operating? It's not that expensive, and it's a way to keep track of who's operating a business within the city.
That's fair. Councilmember Riddle.
I would add just revisiting our neighborhood commercial nodes, revisiting our neighborhood business as a whole, to really reflect the work that our community wants us to do here. They want places to go and walk to a cafe. They want to have services, like professional services provided throughout the city. So I think that will, if we can get more of that in revenue, business revenue, and then just
In sales
in
tax.
general and sales tax, and our community is happier, they can have more gathering spaces, things like that. So I would definitely just say, let's move the needle on those home and neighborhood businesses.
Sounds really good. Guess over on this side. Councilmember Goldman, sorry.
I just comment that the climate coordinator, I feel like we've gotten mixed messages from the community, and that in terms of the survey, yes, it was not the highest priority item. But in terms of people coming to our public meetings when we were discussing the budget, I think that was the most common thing that we were hearing from the public. So not quite sure how to reconcile both of those, other than that it does seem that for a portion of the public, and I'll count myself among it, that they do feel the climate coordinator is a city priority. And we've established a designated stream of funds, the solid waste fee or tax, or what you would call it. So we have established that as a means to help fund the climate position.
Councilmember Saunders?
I agree with Councilmember Goodman.
Thanks. All right. Well, I mean, yeah, I think, specifically on the climate thing, one of the things that I'd always been looking out to is the opportunity for this city to be able to apply for some of these funds now that the Climate Commitment Act has been upheld by the voters. And there's no person per se whose job it is here to do that. And I would not ask staff to take that role on, just because it is a pretty big job trying to manage grants and keep an eye on them. So with that in mind, one of the reasons why, at this point, and to address Councilmember Level's point, yeah, of course, why would you be hiring another staff member when we can barely afford the ones we have right now, is to the opportunity to generate more revenue through grants, which I know that was a priority of that was revealed in that survey that the residents filled out. And so I'm hoping that we're not leaving money on the table, because there will be that funding available for the foreseeable future. And as we've seen, it's not easy to put electric chargers in for EVs. It's not easy to basically coordinate with the other cities on different kinds of initiatives we could all pursue, except by having people that are directly engaged in that kind of work. And so I'm thinking, yeah, in terms of investment, it's an investment I'm willing to make. So I'll go ahead, Councilmember.
I think perhaps a more broader grant writer, grant organizer, grant manager, whether that is part-time in-house or a consultant that maybe has a deeper breadth of knowledge of all the different types of grants and would catch the climate grants as well as some of the other granting opportunities. I think that might be a valuable use of the funds, again, because then it should be paying for itself over by bringing in the grants. But I'm not sure that we have a capital budget that can really support a full climate coordinator trying to do their work. They're going to be stymied by not being able to actually move forward. The grants won't cover all of the work. So I think maybe if we have a blended position, grant writer that is for all kinds of grants, that might give us a better traction with the results. Knowing that the climate will be one of the things that they are pursuing, climate projects.
Councilmember Good.
My comment on the climate coordinator is if the purpose of the climate coordinator is solely to go out and get grants, then I agree with Councilmember Riddle. If they're tasked with doing, other things, I don't know, I just don't, I'm supportive of a climate coordinator on one hand, but if they're just there for grants, then a grant writer would be more beneficial to the city.
Okay. Also, go ahead.
I would say, I think that kind of goes into the discussions we've had about a project management consultant that can really, they're as an owner's representative, so they will be able to work with any of our capital projects, contractors, they'll be able to, and so that could be an interface, and we have sort of that project management on one hand from one arena, and then the grant writing from another arena, and then those work in concert to bring improvements to the city. And it frees up our staff to be a little bit more focused and less about chasing after invoices and stuff like that. Always has to happen.
I have a question for our city administrator. Aren't we hiring a public project manager position now?
Yeah, so the senior project manager position is still open. That's being reworked, the job description to put that back out on the market. So then we would have 2 full-time project managers. And as you know, we just hired our stormwater coordinator, which alleviates the workload of our current project manager. So I think you'll start to see some movement in that direction.
So done. At least partial.
Yeah, I think there is something, I think, to looking at that in-house full-time project manager and then what some of these consultants may be able to provide for us. We're a small city. They may not be interested, to be honest, but they bring a different set of skill sets that sometimes you can't find in an individual. If we find them, that's great though.
Though many people make a living out of carving the niche of small cities. So yeah. All right, so I want to turn sort of the attention to I think one of the things that Councilmember Lebo brought up was, for instance, how we do the vehicle cycling, buying the replacement vehicles and cycling the old ones out. Are there any cost savings to be found there? Are there any kind of revenue enhancements we could do in that area that would help with that? Because as we've seen through our other meetings, that it's expensive. And it's a recurring thing. And given that's part of our structural deficit, do you see any foreseeable way in which we could support that? Go ahead.
Well, you ask the voters to support public safety. And one of the investments is in our assets, such as our vehicles or public works, either equipment assets or infrastructure assets. Because otherwise the money comes out of our general fund. But you have to be clear to say, I'm going to spend the money on this so that I have enough money to spend money on that. But that is what we're spending money on, needs to be very clear to the public that we're just not moving money around.
Go ahead.
And I will say, it seems like initially it's just going to be pulling us out of the unallocated funds. You know, it may feel like, hey, you know, we gave you more money for cars, but nothing else is coming from it, but it's stabilizing the budget. And I think that's the first thing when we're triaging budgets, is just get it stabilized. And then let's figure out what we can spend money on when we have the ability to spend more money. But right now, the fact that we're trajectory into unallocated funds makes me nervous, and I'd like us to be able to have a new baseline.
Well, so I guess the conclusion that we're drawing here is that our budget that we drew up for the biennium is a fiscally responsible one, though we are dipping into unallocated funds. We need to not do that anymore. And yet, you know, apart from a climate coordinator or two or whatever, there's really not a whole lot else that we haven't explored, that we haven't tried to either cut or to enhance. So we're at the situation where we're going to have to make some hard choices. So this is what we all got elected for, right? We're going to be doing this. So I think in future discussions, then we'll have to start exploring other avenues by which we can stop using these unallocated funds. Is that a fair assessment?
Up to a point though, because one should use unallocated contingency and not just let it sit there. Because you do then have the issue of, well, I'm asking the citizens for more money, and they're like, well, but you have this money that you haven't otherwise allocated and is not part of your reserves. So why aren't you drawing down your rainy day fund when your rainy day fund is larger than what you need?
That's true.
You just need to be careful and say, you know, I need $3 million more, and they look at you and say, but you have $3 million of unallocated contingency.
Right. You'd have to be careful in saying, yeah, but we will have zero in about 6 years, and that would be a big problem.
But then you say, well, then I go out for the community in 4 years. Because, you know, the citizens are not, they know that if you have money, you will spend it. And while this city has been very prudent in not spending the money we have, that's not a universal.
True.
I mean, there are cities that find themselves in a much worse financial situation because they've spent money that they don't have on things that the public says, you know, those are nice tos, but they're not have tos.
Okay.
I think it's
Okay.
just looking at the, you know, biennium over biennium and how it's a balanced budget because we're using unallocated, but that's not gonna last,
Right.
you know, biennium's out, and just being proactive. And I think our community is really good about being proactive. They don't want us to scramble at the end.
Yeah.
So I think as a representative of the community, we should listen to their needs.
Yeah.
And follow their desires.
And the vehicles were not they were not actively managed in the past to the point of where they are now, where I think that's a real positive thing. So we're catching up a little bit. But you know, all of our vehicles, they're tools, and they're necessary and they're required. So they should have a priority and not be pushed aside.
I agree. Nice. Okay. All right. Well, I think, you know, with that backdrop, the thing that keeps coming to my mind is that graph that shows the 6-year projection and those two lines, that is to say, our revenues and our expenditures crossing, which does in fact give me some pause. So, you know, we'll take this up again at a future meeting, and of course, we'll have to start thinking about alternatives. So look forward to that discussion with all of you. All right, so with that, I guess we can't have other business since this is a committee of the whole meeting, so entertain a move to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Thank you all.